for the signal. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this special World Economic meeting happening for the first time here in Saudi Arabia. My name is Faisal Abbas. I'm the editor-in-chief of Arab News, and I'll be your moderator for this very special session in this special meeting with some very special speakers and subject matters expert. I am delighted to be joined by Her Excellency Dr. Hala Saeed Al-Yunus, who is the Minister of Planning and Economic Development in the Republic of Egypt. To my immediate left is His Excellency An Dukan, who is the Minister of Trade, Industry and Energy in the Republic of Korea. We are also delighted to be joined by Clifford Kupchan, who, as you know, is the chairman of the Eurasia group. We also have Brad Schneider, who's flew in all the way from the United States on a very long trip, I have to say. He's the congressman from Illinois. And last but certainly not least, representing the private sector and here to give us a lot of insights from his vast experience is Aloke Lohaya, who is the Group Chief Executive Officer in Indorama Ventures. We have 45 minutes today. We have a vast amount of expertise and opinions. We hope to get a bit of your questions into the panel if we can. There will be a microphone around. Just as this is in Saudi Arabia, and if you are a native Arabic speaker, there are translation devices on your chairs or around you in case you need to translate. But let us jump straight into the conversation. I would say ladies first and region first, since we are in Saudi Arabia. Minister Yunus, this is a question for you. I suppose I wouldn't be revealing a big secret if I said Egypt is in a very unique geographical position. Mostly fortunate, but in the last few months has been very unfortunate. You are sort of crushed between the tensions happening up north in Gaza and all the geopolitical repercussions of that, but also you are on the Red Sea, where there has been a lot of disruption to the flow or the normal trade and shipping routes. This session is called What Homeland Economics Means for Trade. But I suppose there is one argument to be made for countries with less challenging circumstances, and there's a whole other argument or way of thinking for a country like Egypt, where the two challenges I mentioned are only one of the very few that you have to challenge. So let me ask you then, how does the government even mitigate when you have all of these randomness and all of this uncertainty going around in a way that you have more than 100 million people who can get affected by any disruption of trade?
Thank you very much. Let me start first by commending the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for hosting the World Economic Forum for the first time. And I'd like to thank the World Economic Forum for inviting me to be among these distinguished panels. Well, your question is twofold. First, talking about the multiple crises that the whole world is facing and the challenges. Definitely, the past few years, the world has been faced by multiple and unprecedented challenges, from the COVID-19 pandemic to the Ukraine war, to the Gaza war that is on our borders, to the tension that is in the MENA region, in addition, of course, to all the repercussions of the climate change. All this have led to, first, the COVID-19 catalyzed, was the main catalyst for the supply chain diversification, and the tension that is happening in the different crises and different war have also underscored the importance of becoming leading resilient and agile trade policies. So this, as you mentioned, have also triggered the argument worldwide on, did globalization really benefit the world economy, or should we lead more of a homeland economics and become more self-sufficient, focus on our food security, on our needs, and on our main production. This argument actually is a little bit deceiving, because when we look to international trade and globalization, it's the main driver for economic growth. It's the main driver for inclusive growth. So what has been happening is basically a sort of distribution of inequality of distribution of technology between developed and developing nation, and the distribution of technology inside the developing economy specifically, because what the developing and middle income countries need is more of transfer of technology, more of an FDI, more of capacity building to their people in order to become more resilient and to become more agile to any external shocks. This why also has triggered a lot of debate on the strategies and policies of offshoring or nearshoring, or just in case and just in time policies. And here, no one size fits all, because you need just in case production in issues related to national security. You need to invest in healthcare, in hospitals, in issues related to climate crises or climate change, in cybersecurity, of course, in addition to all what is related to armed force. So you need to have the inventory of these production, and as has been mentioned by Professor Stern of London School of Economics, the cost of this type of these type of commodities, or the inventory that you need of these type of commodities, you have to amortize on a very low discount rate, because you're not investing only for today, you're investing for generations to come. On the contrary of the just-in-time commodities are all the commodities that we assemble when there is a demand being processed, like the automotive manufacturing, for example. So this is on the global agenda. Coming to Egypt. Egypt is a country that has been faced by multiple unprecedented shocks. Recently, of course, the war in Gaza. What is happening in the Red Sea is that 50% of the shipments that used to pass by the Red Sea have been transferred to the Cape of Good Hope. So this has led to a decrease of our revenues of the Suez Canal receipts from 10 billion. It rose from 6 billion to 10 billion last year. These receipts are cut off for the first 4 years, are cut off to half. So this will impact definitely our foreign exchange receipts, but at the same time, it's raising the prices. It's raising the prices of food. It's raising the prices of energy. So while all the tension have led to soaring prices, normally central banks in most of the countries, they rush to increase interest rates. So raising interest rates makes access to capital costly. At the same time, this leaves middle-income countries with a limited fiscal space to support the less vulnerable. So it was a necessity for Egypt to tackle a structural reform agenda. This structural reform agenda has different folds. First, the macroeconomic stability. So we worked on exchange rate stabilization. We worked on controlling inflation. At the same time, we worked on focusing on the real side of the economy. If you focus on the real side of the economy, which is manufacturing, ICT, and agriculture, you make the economy more productive. You make it more resilient, you make it more competitive, and you have export diversification. The second issue is that you have to invest in your labor force. We're a populous country. We're 110 million people, and we're privileged that 70% of this population is under the age of 40. So we have affordable labor force, and it is very easy to train them. So we invested in our labor force, in the efficiency and efficacy of the labor market, investing in technical education and in vocational training. The third thing is that we invested in our infrastructure. Egypt enjoys a strategic location between Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, but we had to invest in our infrastructure. We invested in having 58 ports. 18 ports are commercial ports. And we also invested in high railway train, and in road network to link the sea, Mediterranean and the Red Sea, with the inland destination. So investing in this infrastructure was very important to us in order to expand our import and export base. In addition, that we invested in green manufacturing.
Got it. Well, few things to unpack there, Minister. Thank you so much for starting us off with so much useful information and things to analyze. I do want to get to the Inflation Reduction Act and ask the congressman as well about that. We'll get to that in 1 second, but I think a key term you used is in these sort of crises is there's no one size that fits all. Indeed, and I want to go to Mr. Lohia. So two things. Tensions are not exclusives to the Red Sea, and it's not only the government that needs to make decisions. We're looking at now what's happening at the South China Sea. You represent a major private sector entity. Now, I have to say, Thailand is in a unique situation because like this country, it has managed to balance its relationship between East and West very well. It's a very delicate balance, but they do it very well. But how does, in the terms of decision making, in terms of planning, in terms of choosing which policy to adopt, how do such tensions and unpredictability impact your bottom line, supply chain management, and overall thinking?
Yeah, thank you, Faisal. So as a businessman, you know, we do obviously have a lot more flexibility than nations, but we are in 35 countries. And what we have had to do in the last 2 years is make a significant pivot. Let me explain what I mean. You know, we had a brilliant 20 years till 5 years ago, where our petrochemical business was growing by leaps and bounds. The geopolitics was stable. The interest rates were very low. So all in all, we were enjoying a good time. Since COVID, first with the COVID, we had the supply chain disruptions around the world, and that led to a lot of pipeline inventory that got built, which was artificial demand. We saw the negative effect of that in 22 and 23 when what we call destocking started taking place. So suddenly the consumer demand was probably the same, but the factory demand, the demand that we cater to, shrunk by 15% or so. So that hit our bottom line quite significantly. But that was a good catalyst for us to think about what really is happening in the world. The second is soon after COVID, then we had the Russia-Ukraine war that the minister mentioned. That led to Europe becoming totally uncompetitive from an energy standpoint, which have had a lasting impact and continues to have that impact. Very soon after that, we had the interest rate spikes and now the Middle East crisis, the Red Sea crisis. All of these things have impacted our supply chains and our competitiveness in our different countries. The topic of Homeland economics is very dear to me in the sense that we are in 35 countries. And that means we have to now make our bets and shift our bets a lot. You know, apart from China and all the capacity that they have generated, you know, China was a growing demand around the world for the last 20 years. Suddenly in the last 5 years, we don't see that sort of demand. But the new capacities that are being built, again, this could be because of Homeland economics, and it is, just to have the security of supply within the country. But now what we see is also India catching up or will catch up. So a lot of new capacity is getting built in India as well. What's happening with all of this is that there is a lot of overcapacity globally, which means that some of the legacy assets in manufacturing have to go. They can't sustain. What we are doing is basically we are reducing 10% of our capacity. That means from 20 million tons, we are going to take out 2 million tons, have 18 million tons of capacity that we can fill because operating rates are very high. Operating rates are required to have a sustainable cost advantage. So that's one big decision that we are taking, and we have announced that publicly. Secondly, with the high interest rates, we are also looking at how do we deleverage our balance sheet because, as the minister said, inflation is high, costs are high, margins are low because of the overcapacity. So the squeeze is happening in the private sector as well. But I'm very glad that we have been able to come to a conclusion on our strategy going forward for the next 10, 15 years and take advantage of the homeland economics in the sense that the oversupply that's being created because of homeland economics, like in India, we do, and we can see that from the stock market in India, the market capitalization of the Indian firms is far in excess of other Asian countries. For us, our big bet is in the US, where they have ample shale, and that competitiveness will remain, in my opinion. That's where we are investing. We are investing in India, where there's a large population and a stable government. So all in all, we have made our decisions on where we have to have a degrowth in Europe. We can't sustain the cost, the energy cost in Europe. So my point being that homeland economics is great for countries that can leverage on it, have leverage. But I come from Thailand, and in Thailand we have very limited resources. Our tourism is a big GDP contributor, and that's where our politicians are focused on. For us, manufacturing is going to be more in India, more in the US, and take advantage of the homeland economics.
And I can only vouch for that, Mr. Lohia. I was recently in Thailand, and I think I interviewed the Prime Minister, and I started the profile saying it's only in Thailand where you interview the Thai Prime Minister in an American coffee on Chinese New Year in Chinatown. And it's an indicator of how well the country manages its relationships between East and West. Congressman, I know you're here to talk about homeland economics, but we can't escape talking about homeland politics, particularly that this is an election year. And
I hadn't noticed.
You know, the old saying is when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. So I think the whole world is now vaccinating and preparing because we're not sure what's going to happen. But it's actually, the problem is a bit bigger than that because you have essentially polarization to an extent which we've not seen before. There seems to be shrinking middle ground between the two parties. Whether people want to trade with the US or are looking for investment, you name it, we're no longer sure whether the next administration is going to be for more inclusion, more world international agreements, or is going to rip apart international agreements and say we're no longer a part of this trade agreement, etc. What's the sentiment in, I'm not going to ask you about your predictions for the, although you're very free to give us your opinion on it, but I'm more interested on the business impact of this polarization to the US economy and for the rest of the world.
Well, thank you. And let me say, as I said before, it is a great privilege to be here and to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia hosting the World Economic Forum. This is an exciting moment. I'll take off my congressional hat. Before I was in Congress, I was in business, and I'll put on my consultant's hat. Two things that make business complicated, and you'll probably agree with me, is complexity and uncertainty. And I think the politics in the United States, other places in the world, but I'll focus on the United States, is creating both complexity and uncertainty, Absolutely. Which makes it a challenge for business. We don't know what's going to happen in November. I know what I want to happen, and forget about the politics. Let me talk about the more globally. I believe fundamentally, I say this all the time, that the world is a safer place when the United States is engaged with the rest of the world. Many places around the world look to the United States for leadership. We have a unique both ability, capacity, and I'll say responsibility to convene. And I think I'll bring it back to, as we're talking about Homeland economics and trade in general. There's two competing strategies, not just on trade, but in other issues. One I'll call partnership or alliances, and the other control. We're building empires. And I think that's where you see the big division in the world at the moment. If we're going to have resilient, robust supply chains, I believe partnerships are the far better strategy to move forward to. Where, we're talking about Egypt at the center of, in many ways, the center of the world, right? The Mediterranean, the Red Sea, which is really the opening into the Indian Ocean, the nexus between Africa and Asia and Europe. In a world of control or dominance, that's one dynamic that doesn't allow the opportunity for development of workforce, transfer of technology. In a world of partnership and alliances, it's much easier to get to equilibrium. And what we had in COVID was a breakdown of equilibrium. I have my hand puppets, but the world of just in time was a very delicately balanced. I was an industrial engineer by training. We spent an entire generation creating this delicate balance of relationships and supply chains, and COVID broke that, completely locked it up. And when we came out of the pandemic, or started to come out, the world was opened up in a very different way, and those supply chains were broken. We're moving now towards more of a need for not just resiliency, but redundancy. And people learned you can't have a single source of supply. People learned that we need to have supplies either onshore or closer to shore. It became the phrase of friendshoring. But at the end of the day, I remember the Zoom calls we had at the beginning of the pandemic with my colleagues, and they were talking, bring everything home. The worst thing we could do is bring everything home, because we just take a problem and relocate it. But when we think about it strategically, and we build on those alliances and partnerships to find United States, for example, with I think our birth rate now is about 1.6. We're going to see a shrinking population without immigration. We have to drive innovation. But Egypt, with 110 million, with so many people under the age of 40, we have an obvious partner to drive innovation and find a productive workforce. I think that's the future that we need to move towards.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I want to go to Clifford. We've heard about wars, we've heard about tensions, we've heard about unpredictability in many parts of the world. However, your group, the Eurasia Group, has identified artificial intelligence as the biggest threat of the year. And obviously, I wouldn't be saying something new if I said there's a lot of people who also see a lot of opportunity in AI and might have a completely counter argument. But I think myself and the audience would be very interested to understand how did the Eurasia Group reach that conclusion at this very delicate time as well about AI.
Well, thank you, and thanks to the WEF for inviting me. I'll speak to that question, and I'd like to make a few other quick points,
Sure.
Please.
Sure.
On our last, Ian and I write this top risk report every year when we kind of lay out the top risks of the year. The top risk this year was actually the U.S. against itself. And we talked about 3 wars, the U.S. against itself, Ukraine, and the Middle East. I think AI was on the list. The reason it's on the list is that its downside applications are quite worrisome. I mean, if generative AI gets into the wrong hands, it's very easy to create weapons that are destructive. It's very easy to do deep fakes. That there are a lot of real threats that come out of AI. The biggest one that we worry about is that there could be a military application, a development by the US or China that creates a breakout capability. In other words, it would give the country that gets the breakout dominance in the military sphere and could really throw off the strategic balance. So those are some of the risks that we worry about. But more broadly on homeland economics, I'd like to make two main points, I think, which are that, in my view anyway, the main geopolitical driver, or drivers in the world right now, pertain to the US and China. That is the heart of darkness of great power rivalry. And I think that relationship is quite worrisome. And I think whether Biden is reelected or Trump is reelected, and I'll come back to that, we're headed towards a strategical degradation in great power relations, in US-China relations. That means that in the tech sphere, in the high-tech sphere, which is the center of the struggle, the choices are going to have to be made. I mean, right now, the US administration, Jake Sullivan talks about a high fence around a small yard, AI, chips, quantum, where the US is going to impose ever more stringent controls, export controls mainly. And that will mean that countries, I think even like Thailand or the countries that we're talking about here, that don't want to make a choice, are going to increasingly have to make a choice. And when we talk about homeland economies, about national security intervening with trade, I think that's really where the hard choices are going to have to be made. I don't think that the prognosis is very good. So that's the first point I'd really like to make. The second point I'd like to make pertains to, Trump tariffs and the possibility of what the tariff world could look like under President Trump. I personally think if the election were held today that Trump would win. I don't think it'd be terribly close. If you look at swing state polling, which we do quite closely, and this election is going to be decided in 6 or 7 swing states. Trump is ahead in about half of them above the margin of error in those states. So it's not early anymore. It's not early. It's still enough time for that to change, but I think this election is really a toss-up at best from my perspective as an analyst. What I worry about the most is the Trump team, and I talk to them, and we talk to them. I'm not, on either side. But the Trump team is very seriously considering a 10% universal tariff and a 30% across-the-board tariff on Chinese products. That would create, I think, deep divisions in the international trading system, a real jolt to the international trading system. Accompany that with efforts to crack down on Chinese offshore assembly, a way to get around tariffs, which I know the Trump folks are really focused on harsher export controls, and you've got a real impetus to even greater movement of supply chains to third countries, to Vietnams, the Malaysias, the Thailands, to get away from this increasingly divisive tariff environment. Economists say it would be inflationary. Economists say that you would get a stronger dollar. So I want to just stop there with those, I think, not very encouraging, but quite possible outcomes that we'll see.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your insight. Minister, thank you so much for your patience. I have 2 follow-up questions on what the honorable gentleman had said. One with regards to cooperation, globalization, and one with regards to AI. Allow me to start with the question on AI. Speaking of it, the rise of generative artificial intelligence is driving a global race for chips and semiconductors. How do you see the future of semiconductors? Where do you see it landing? And what's your country's policies regarding this, given your particularly interesting geographical location?
Yeah, well, can you hear? Okay, first, let me begin with my colleague thanking this wonderful opportunity, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the WEF. The AI, the semiconductor industry will accelerate the current industrial policy competitions among the major countries. As you all know, when we talk about homeland economics or economic statecraft, probably the semiconductor industry is foremost prominent example of how major countries are now competing with the industrial policies. And the rise of AI, the generative AI, will make the current situation much more fierce. And then one of the concern is when all countries globally watch, the major countries are pouring the governmental resources in developing this strategically important sector, then many more countries will follow suit, because all those countries will think different industries will very important strategically for their economies. So now we are in very dangerous phase of the industrial competition. And probably that demands kind of the global effort, the global trade community to work together to contain these situations. It is inevitable for government and public sector to support the rapid technological development like the generative AI. But on the other hand, we have to find a way to somehow contain this race, not to cause too much trouble for the global trade. So currently, for example, the World Trade Organization became much weaker than we expected or we watched for a long time. But probably the public as well as private trade community find a way to revive this institution, somehow to contain the current situation. Otherwise, numerous developing countries probably be alienated from the current so-called industrial competition race or the economic statecraft, the competition.
So I wanted to also ask you, relating to the last comment you made. Now, your country is very much inspirational. I visited several times, went to the War Museum. I think it's inspiration for us in this part of the world to see a country that was completely demolished after the World War, how you managed to get to where you are, the investment in education. I would say your country has benefited from globalization. Globalization, as we've heard from the congressman, partnerships in general, is essentially meant to be a good thing, or at least a good thing on paper, yet it hasn't benefited all of the world equally. And I'm very keen to hear your thoughts as to why that happened, and more importantly, how do we fix it going forward?
That's very different questions. But what I hope from the global community is probably the Korean economic development or industrial development can give you a very interesting and inspiring example of how you can implement the policies. For example, one of the good example is our Korean cultural industry sector. Like many other countries, the Korean government people are very, very reluctant to open cultural industry sectors. Like the protection of the cultural contents is always seen as like the protection of our value, national, the history, tradition, and so forth. But so probably you can imagine when we had to open this door, particularly after global financial crisis, we were almost collapsed, and we need the support from global community. But typically, many countries made the conditions, or even IMF made the condition to borrow more money. We have to open our door. So that was how we reluctantly opened our culture industry. But now, our culture industry sector learned to invest and upgrade their content. That is how nowadays our songs and dramas and those cultural content, we never imagined that our contents will be enjoyed or shared by the global community, but that is what is happening now. So the agricultural sector, culture industry sectors, or some key manufacturing sectors, we always face huge domestic challenge. But probably if you study the Korean experience, probably you will have very, very good example. In our retrospect, history tells us that the key industry to strengthen your industry is globalization. That's the answer.
Understood. Well, we do have a very interesting panel. I have a lot of questions, but I want to open the floor. In case you have any questions, please raise your hand. We do have 5 minutes, so maybe 1 or 2 questions if you want to ask. We have a mic around. All right. Until the questions are ready, I want to go back to Minister Yunus. Now, despite all the trouble in the region, there has been some very good news coming out of Egypt. Most recently, there was a very impressive investment from the United Arab Emirates. The sentiment has been very positive since then. But allow me to challenge you a little bit. This is not the first time Gulf countries or Arab countries have come to invest in Egypt and reaffirmed the long-standing belief that we believe in this economy and we are not going to allow it to fail. Could you talk to us, however, there has been incidents in the past where the circumstances defied even those investments. So if you can talk to us a bit about what's different this time, if there are any structural reforms or changes that are implemented this time to ensure that those countries who are, both from an Arab brotherly point of view and from a business point of view want to invest in Egypt, that they can rest assured.
Well, let me tell you that this era, this period specifically, Egypt is determined to position itself as one of the world's leading open market-oriented economy. We have worked, as I said, we have embarked on a structural reform agenda. Basically, in addition to focusing on the real side to make the economy more productive, we're also shifting the landscape of the economy towards more private sector. We came out of a period of political instability between 2011 and 2014, where the government had to step in and pitch a lot of investment to upgrade the level of infrastructure, which was deteriorating, and we used to have negative growth rate between 2011 and 2014. So now we're changing the landscape, moving more towards more private sector. Now the share of private sector, we have in the structural reform agenda, we have targets for having the share of the private sector to become 65% by the year 2026. It's now almost close to 42%, reaching 50% in the next fiscal year. We have also launched our IPO program for 32 companies. About 8 companies have been already divested to private sector. In addition to how we have issued for the first time a state ownership policy to show the exit of the government from certain sectors and specifically to comfort the private sector with what we call a level playing field policy. This policy was very important for the private sector to show them that if the public sector is investing, it's going to be on a level playing field, and this was one of the main concerns of the private sector. So we're totally changing the landscape, streamlining our trade policy, streamlining our investment policy, in addition to the major investment that we have done in our infrastructure. So it is not a one-time reform. It's a full spectrum of a reform agenda that we are looking forward to more investment, to more FDI to come to Egypt.
Absolutely. I mean, we're almost out of time, but there's just so many other topics that I would like to discuss. We didn't even start talking about the pandemic, which kind of opened our eyes regarding supply chain management. Mr. Loya, let me take this question to you. As I said, one of the main triggers for this conversation, at least to the mass public, was what happened 4 years ago during the pandemic and its impact, of course, on supply chains. 2 things. What can you tell us from your company's perspective? And would you say, how would you rate government today around the world. Would you say the lesson has been learned? Are there practices that are there to prevent such a crisis from happening again, supply chain crisis, or not?
Well, as we know, we are again in a supply chain crisis with the Red Sea crisis. So the just-in-time model, I think, is now going to move to just-in-case. I see that as a very distinct possibility. And I think the geopolitics plays a big role in all of this. What I find is that countries that can leverage on their strengths, like let's take, for instance, the Russian crude. China, India are benefiting immensely from this positioning that they have. And they've both got big populations. So these are the countries that are really enjoying and growing, whereas smaller nations with lesser resources, they don't have much, I won't call them victims, but they have very limited potential on what they can do. So I think this supply chain issue is a big question, and nearshoring is happening. Like it or not, Indorama Ventures enjoys from this nearshoring because we are in the 35 countries. We have a lot more protectionism coming along, which is all very different from what it was 5 years ago. And it all started with the COVID-19.
Well, we're officially out of time, but I probably won't sleep tonight if I don't ask you, Congressman, whether you agree with Clifford's assessment on the outcome of the elections this year.
I do not.
You do not, okay. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry we ran out of time, but this has been a fascinating debate. We could sit here for hours. Thank you so much for being a lovely audience, and enjoy the rest of the forum. Thank you so much.